So today's Bible lesson is class 35, and I've entitled it Tamar Takes Action, and we will be considering the entirety of chapter 38. And we'll just dive right in. Verse 1, 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again, she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Chezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. As we said last week, Genesis chapter 38 is a brief interlude placed within what scholars call broadly the Joseph novella. Handel writes, Joseph's plight is interrupted by a story about Judah and his family from the J source, in which themes of knowledge, deception, and recognition continue to reverberate. The story begins with some intermarrying between Judah's family and the neighboring Canaanites. Of this, Handel writes, Judah's marriage to a Canaanite woman is not seen as problematic in the story, nor is the arranged marriage of his firstborn son to Tamar. The J source differs from 24 verse 3 and the priestly source in 27:46 through 28 verse 2, which I went back and read those cross references. And in those passages, there is condemnation for marrying Canaanites or outsiders, specifically in the second instance of the end of 27, start of 28. That's where Rebecca and Isaac don't want Jacob to marry Hittite women / Canaanite women after, like what? Sorry, folks. Sorry, June walked in the room. As I was saying, that was an example where that sort of marriage was frowned upon. We don't have to read that into this story. The names of the three sons foreshadow the story arc. Means evil. Onan sounds like sorrow, trouble, or wicked. And Shelah can mean request or something asked for, and put in context of what Tamar was in a roundabout way requesting, which was for the family of Judah to do right by her. He symbolizes that that request that was not answered in the right way. Moving on. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. Remember, his name literally means that. And the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to raise her. Raise up offspring for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Handel writes, the name and his moral quality, wicked, or better, evil, Ra, are anagrams. And so in the Hebrew, evil, the word for evil, Ra, and are an anagram. Remember, there are no vowels in Hebrew, meaning they reflect one another, and this is on purpose. But God put him to death because of his intrinsic evil, but no one else knows why he died. This has unsettling theological implications about God's actions in the world, and many commentators move quickly past the death of We do well to remember that these stories were written down centuries after they were meant to have happened, and the characters in these stories are sometimes typecast to fit the overall arc of the narrative. Bad guys are bad guys, good guys are good guys. In reality, the characters in our tidy narratives are more complex. If this is the way God operates in the world, people being intrinsically evil and then snuffing them out, we may well wonder why God did not strike down modern evil persons in their tracks before they could do real harm. Think Adolf Hitler, think John Wayne Gacy, etc. We do have more to go on in regards to Onan's death. He was killed by God for failing in his familial obligation to sire children by way of his dead brother's wife. And you probably can imagine that finding good illustrations for this part of the story were few and far between. As a matter of fact, I didn't really find any for reasons I think are obvious. Ebeling writes of this circumstance: widows without children were protected by Levitical marriage, which required that a childless widow marry one of her deceased husband's brothers in order to continue the family line of her dead husband and pass on his land inheritance, or nahala, which means heritage. Nahala means heritage. Hybert writes, Judah's instructions to Onan are strange to the modern reader. However, they are based on an Israelite custom designed to protect widows and to maintain stable families. In biblical times, married women depended on their husbands and sons for economic support. A woman without a husband or sons, like Tamar, would have difficulty finding a way to survive. To protect the childless widow, an Israelite law required that the deceased husband's brother have sexual relations with his sister-in-law. As a result, she could have children who would in time provide economic support for their mother. They would also be regarded as the sons of the woman's deceased husband. However, brothers frequently resisted their responsibility, as Onan does in this story. They did so because they saw their older brother's sons as their rivals to the family's inheritance and estate. End quote. That was Hybert. And Onan's not wrong. Any child he produces with Tamar will be considered his deceased older brothers, and as such would inherit the lion's share of the estate. Fritham writes, Onan sabotages the intent of the relationship in order to gain Er's inheritance for himself upon Judah's death. The firstborn would receive a double share. He regularly uses Tamar for sex, but makes sure she does not become pregnant by not letting his semen enter her. He thereby formally fulfills his duty, lest the role be passed on to his other brother and he lose Er's inheritance in this way. But in his attempt at self-preservation, he forgoes his responsibility to care for Tamar and provide a future for her and her, or Er's, children. To this, Fritham writes, this willful deception would be observable to Tamar, but God's observation leads to Onan's death, again by unspecified means. So here we begin to see in the story the groundwork for what we will later discover to be the main point. The point being, God is passionate in the defense of the vulnerable, in this case, the widows like Tamar. That's the moral takeaway. If you fall asleep midway through the lesson, that's the gist of the story. Moving on, verse 11. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, this is right after Onan has died, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Hybert writes, Tamar has become a social and economic member of Judah's household through marriage to his son So when Judah told Tamar to stay in her father's household, he abandoned his legal responsibilities toward her. Though Judah presents this action as a temporary solution, the storyteller suggests that Judah wanted to protect his last son, Shelah, and had no intention of taking her back. So Tamar waits for her young brother-in-law to come of age so that she might enter into right relation with her dead husband's family and produce offspring on Er's behalf. Moving on, verse 12. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me? What will you give me that you may come into me? So Tamar discovers Judah's apparent deception and intent by her. Shelah has grown. She sees Shelah has grown and knows that she has not been placed under his roof to produce children for her dead husband, Hybert writes, without a husband or children, Tamar has no status or future in her ancient society. She has been placed in this position because Judah, the man responsible for her, has failed at his responsibilities. Her only option is to take matters into her own hands. She comes up with a plan to trick Judah into fulfilling his responsibilities required by Israelite law. Her plan is to sleep with Judah. Handel writes, the tables turn when Tamar recognizes the truth sometime later and plans a counter-deception. Entrance of Enaim, literally opening of the eyes is what that means. Opening of the eyes, which Handel writes, is an apt setting for her dawning perception. Her change of clothes from widow's garb to a prostitute's reverses her situation from a dependent figure to an active agent, a woman empowered to negotiate with men about sex. Verse 17, he answered, he being Judah, I will send you a kid from the flock. And she said, only if you give me a pledge until you send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord, and the staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Tamar tells Judah the deposit is to guarantee future payment. However, her real reason appears to be identifying Judah as the father of her child should she become pregnant. The narrator does not criticize Judah for going to a prostitute. Remember, adultery can only be carried out with a woman who is married or under the care of her father's household. So consorting with prostitutes as such did not fall under the category of adultery in those days. Technically. Handel writes, by taking his insignia, Tamar symbolically assumes his role as head of the lineage and tribe of Judah, and she ensures its proper continuance. Judah, unknowing, fulfills his duty. Verse 20. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside? But they said, no prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, no prostitute has been here. Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid and you cannot find her. Now I included the translation of the Common English Bible here as well to note that instead of prostitute, the Common English Bible translates those words as consecrated worker, and then later holy woman, same word. It's a different word than is used back in verse 15, where we read that Judah mistakes Tamar for a prostitute. So that the one back in verse 15 is literally prostitute. And in this, when they're actually asking strangers, I guess, about where is this prostitute, they use more delicate language, we'll put it that way. Hybert writes, both consecrated worker and holy woman translate from the same Hebrew word. Why Judah's friend asks for the holy woman rather than the prostitute, a different Hebrew word than in Genesis 38:15, which I just said, is unclear. The Hebrew word for holy woman has traditionally been interpreted as temple prostitute. Some biblical scholars claim that religious prostitution existed in the ancient Near East. The idea is that people engaged in ritual sexual relations at a holy site to promote fertility. However, there is virtually no evidence that such practices existed, at least back in the time frame we're talking about here. So temple prostitute is probably a polite euphemism for prostitute, writes Handel. And if Handel is correct, then descriptions like call girl or escort may be modern equivalents. Either way, Judah cannot find the quote-unquote prostitute and recover his signet and cord and his staff, or pay her the young goat he owes her for her services. The townspeople say that there are no prostitutes there. No prostitute has been here is literally true. Remember, she is not a prostitute. Judah remains deceived and fears being laughed at, which is ironic in light of what is to come. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. I said earlier that prostitution did not constitute, sleeping with a prostitute did not legally constitute adultery. It becomes very different when the girl is part of a household, either married to into a house or is having a father be responsible. And so Judah is upset here because he, being the father-in-law, is legally responsible for her actions, and that's what makes her becoming pregnant evidence of adultery in his eyes. And so that's where he's getting this indignant anger here. But moving on, so Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." That's quite intense. And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again." Fritham writes, when Tamar's pregnancy becomes evident, she is charged with harlotry. Upon hearing the news, Judah assumes the role of judge. She is under his authority through her family and exacts the death penalty. And the irony is sharp. When Judah saw her as a prostitute, he used her. When he sees her in this capacity as his daughter-in-law, he condemns her. Clearly, Judah applies a double standard. And by the way, the death penalty in adultery cases applied to both parties. And while some regard Judah's actions in the subsequent verses as magnanimous, keep in mind that his own life may well hang in the balance if he fails to make good by way of Tamar. But Tamar has an ace up her sleeve. She presents Judah's possessions for all to see with the charge that it is the owner of these possessions who is the father of her child. Judah is caught with his pants, albeit formally, down. Hybert writes, Judah admits that he hasn't fulfilled his responsibilities to Tamar, who is a member of his family. He even recognizes her actions as just and fair. Modern readers may be troubled by her acting as a prostitute and sleeping with her father-in-law. However, the story itself completely defends Tamar. The story thus praises women who claim their rights when the men responsible for them fail to do what is right. So all that to say, very messy, very problematic in many ways, but this was the world they were living in, and given Tamar's context, what else could she really do? And she is not judged for it in the story. She comes off well, actually. Well enough, all things considered. Here's the conclusion of the story. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. And I just gotta say before I move on, after being in the room with all three of my children being born, this seems quite quite a troubling. This is not the birth story you want. One. Well, never mind. Well, anyway, I digress. Handel writes this. The story concludes with the birth of twins, echoing the birth of Jacob and Esau. These brothers too are struggling in the womb over who will be the firstborn, and Perez prevails over Zerah. Both are clans of Judah, mentioned in Numbers chapter 26. Perez will be David's ancestor, ending the story with a hint of future glory. Fritham writes, again, we encounter confusion about the firstborn. Although Perez is actually born first, Zerah's arm has already come out, so he is designated firstborn. Once again, the secondborn carries on the line of promise for David and Jesus to descend from Perez. And you notice this continued theme of secondborn usurping firstborn. And at this point, you have to really question whether or not we should be designating the firstborn as having special merit or privilege in the first place, which I think is the whole point of this continued theme in these stories. To conclude, Ebeling writes, the story of Tamar and Judah shows the tremendous importance of the inheritance in ancient Israelite society. Indeed, one of the main reasons why widows were so valuable is that inheritance laws did not provide for them. In general, a man's property went to his nearest male relative or relatives, usually his sons, upon his death. Only in exceptional cases did daughters receive an inheritance from their fathers, such as in the story of Zelophehad and his 5 daughters, which you can read about in Numbers chapter 27. And I confess, I had not remembered that story, and I went back and checked it out. Basically, Moses makes a ruling in regards to 5 daughters who find themselves without really any suitable male heirs in their family. And after Moses consults with the Lord, comes back and says that it's right for those 5 daughters to be given the property. But there was a lot of legal precedent written down in the Levitical laws, even around that time, to basically ensure that the property stayed with the suitable male heirs. But it got really messy when questions came up as to who that would be, as we just read in the story. All this to say, Tamar serves as an example of a woman working within an unjust system for justice on her own account. As was mentioned in the previous slide, the consequences of her actions would be lauded in the centuries to come, sorry, that's a bad sentence. I should have proofread that. It would be lauded. Tamar's actions would be lauded in the centuries to come. Her ancestors include King David and Jesus of Nazareth, and is mentioned in the genealogy as found in the Gospel of Matthew. Tamar's name shows up there. Fritham writes, and I just took a picture of this rather than type it all out. This text lifts up social issues of social responsibility and justice in an especially forceful way, with a focus on the plight of women. The text offers 2 primary perspectives. On the one hand, the ancient author recognized Tamar as the one misused by a key authority figure in her life. In spite of her oppression, she possesses resources to find a way into a more hopeful future. She subverts Judah's intentions and accomplishes a stunning reversal of authority. Tamar's resourcefulness occurs within the order of creation. God does not act directly. In other words, she takes the initiative here. On the other hand, the author presents Judah as one who misuses his authority and fails in both his familial and communal responsibilities. He chooses a self-serving route that places in jeopardy the future of both Tamar and the community to which they belong. The text thus speaks sharply about the use and abuse of power within the family and in the community of faith. But the text is not finally pessimistic regarding changes that can take place within individuals to transform such situations into good. Judah does change and acknowledges that the person he had abused is indeed the one who has been righteous. His experience with Tamar, leading to his public confession, may be decisive when he risks his life for the sake of the family's future, as we will read about in future chapters 43 and 44. When he does so, he follows Tamar's example. Those are my sources that I consulted. I'll bring us back. You may unmute yourselves. Who is familiar with that story? I first heard it in probably middle school. No, I would have been in high school because I can remember the teacher who I had. So I was probably in early high school, and we were reading it in Bible study class, Sunday school class. And I really don't remember what points were made about it. I just remember that when we got to the part where Onan spilled his semen on the ground, I was like 14. So I laughed because I thought I wasn't expecting that. And I was chided, like, that's just serious, like, don't laugh at the word of the Lord. And I was like, okay, so sorry. I only bring up the story to segue into this point, which is, this is a story that is very clearly placed outside of our own modern context with very different cultural expectations at play. And so that has to be stated up front for us to arrive at the real point, which is that persons like Tamar, who are in vulnerable positions, tenuous positions in the hierarchy of their society, that God cares for those persons, and that justice must be done by them. That is the point. But but if you don't understand the world in which it lives in, it's just a strange story, and it still is a strange story in my estimation. But I guess I'll stop talking now. I've done a lot of talking. I'll turn it over.
Well, I find it troubling. I wasn't familiar with this story. I guess when you teach Sunday school, they skip that story. When you're doing that story of Joseph, we probably don't bring that up with young children. But but anyway, I find it troubling that this line of lineage down through David and then Jesus comes through this deception and all of the there's so much deception and the people in the story are greedy for inheritances and all of that, and Tamar is deceptive as well, even though I guess she has to look out for herself. But I don't know, it seems troubling to have that in the Bible with all this detail and in this lineage story. I don't know. I find it troubling.
For me,
I hear you. Go ahead.
I see it as God's will working through the situation. The fact that Tamar decided to do this herself was a very bold move on her part. Of course, she could have been put to death, or she could have been found out. The fact that she became pregnant, that doesn't always happen in one time. And the fact then that Jacob and Esau, are coming from them. So it's to me, it's just God working through the generations to bring about what he has planned with the birth of Jesus. And it shows that God can use evil for good. There are other people in the Bible that are not so great, but yet God uses them.
Well, there are quite a few people not so great as we've been studying.
I want to I think, go ahead, Janet.
Well, I'm with Nancy. I feel sorry for Tamar, but the fact that she did this deception and yet she's listed in the lineage, I guess one of 5 women listed in the lineage of Christ, that deception bothers me too. But, she, I guess, really went along with trying to stay with the chosen rather than being, out with the Canaanites and all that. But I don't know, it just bothers me.
I guess here's how I feel about it. Tamar doesn't have really any good options except be given away to various men for the exchange of property and for keeping property in certain places. That is bad, categorically bad. It's just across the board bad. And in that bad situation, amongst a variety of bad options, a better option is to be married into a house that has some property and possessions, and then to be the wife that would produce the offspring that would inherit a double portion of that. Well, she was within her really poorly set up social construct, at least in relation to what she deserves as an individual made in God's image. She had it better than most, but still had a bad hand. And when her husband died, the expectations of the community were, that she can still have that place of prestige, even though just the fact her husband died didn't leave her out with nothing, which is exactly what Judah seemed to have been angling for, sending her back to the family farm, but still contractually beholden to Judah's household, really left her with no future. And so the deception happens in that context, with a variety between literally a rock and a hard place and then several more hard places. The impressive thing is that she took the initiative to at least bring about what that society thought of as the right action, even though it's still a mess. Um,
Right action in the wrong way.
yeah, it's still a mess. And so the reason oh boy, I guess people like to hold up this story as a story of an example of a woman in a bad situation taking the initiative and making a way for herself. And it is that, which tells you how bad things were in the world that these things were happening. And to your point, Sue, this isn't the last questionable woman who gets into that list. And maybe the fact that the questionable women,
they talk so much about women and being property, and I understand that. But when I think of Abraham and Sarah says, get rid of her, and he does it. So she has some power. And here again is a person that decided she was going to have some power, and she did. And Esther stepped forward, and she demonstrated power to save the Jews. And then there was Saul's mother who prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed for a son. She went forward, and I mean, you can include Ruth, the Moabite, that decided to stay. I just think there are a lot of times. Look at Abigail. Oh my goodness, Abigail just jumped right in and went right over Nabal or whatever his name was. There's another time, and sometimes I think they keep talking about how the women were put down, but I think when they needed to come forward, they did. And I think they did it through God's strength.
Well, you were breaking up a little bit there, but I heard enough to get the gist. And the structures, the societal structure was certainly slated against women. They really didn't have very much volition, which is why it becomes impressive when these women in these stories put people like Judah in a position where they're publicly shamed, even by their own standards, even within their framework of their own rules, which were messed up, puts them to shame in their own framework. And then Judah eats crow, and she ends up having being the mother of his tribe, going down the line. Again, though, to your point, Nancy and Janet, it also makes you feel queasy too, that deception, when people are utilizing deception to bring about what is in retrospect a slightly more just situation, then the situation from the onset was pretty bleak. This is the analogy I'm about to make leapt into my mind, and it is by no means a fit corollary to what we're talking about. But just as an example of where you would do something that in other circumstances was not ethically preferable or ethically right. I know a person who is a very literal person who will not tell a lie for any reason. And when I've asked this person if, say they were back in the context of the Holocaust, they would lie if they were hiding somebody, say, under their floorboards or in their attic. This person has said that they would get evasive rather than lie. They would just kind of fog, distract or divert or something like that. In my opinion, in a situation like that, where the consequence is the loss of human life, I would lie through my teeth. Now, this being said, deception is evidence of a breakdown in our relating to one another, of humans relating to one another. But that was just an example that popped in my head where it becomes a necessary for a better goal. This is a difficult ethical discussion, but that example is more straightforward. And my friend who would not lie even in that circumstance, I just think they missed the forest for the trees, where in complex situations, sometimes you really are between an ethical rock and a hard place. And this is part of our broken humanity, where even deception in some context brings about a better result, but is also evidence of a real problem in your society. I don't know if that makes sense. And I don't, the corollary between, hiding somebody in the context of the Holocaust to this situation with Tamar, they're very different circumstances completely, but that was an example of where I could think of deception being the better of a variety of bad options.
Yeah.
I guess the moral is don't marry somebody whose name is that means evil.
Or Evil Knievel.
Well, see, again, this is where
Don't marry someone named evil.
yeah. It bears in mind these are stories written down hundreds of years later, where these, like, do we really know much about Onan and I mean, they're
All we know is what the Bible says. They were
What about
evil.
Shayla? Does it ever mention him again?
No.
This guy Shayla.
I mean, I didn't do a word search for his name going forward, so I don't know more than what I shared today. Perhaps he's tucked into a genealogy somewhere, or maybe there's
I'm just curious. I just thought, maybe since this supposedly carried on Judah's line, couldn't Shayla have done that?
Oh, it says that it ends with Judah not sleeping with Tamar again. So presumably would have given. Could you imagine?
Oh God.
I know. And again, I'm not about to make anything close to a theological point or even an insightful point, except for as I was conceptualizing the birth of the twins in the end, where you've got one arm coming out and coming back in, and then an entirely another child jumping ahead. I'm thinking, like, this sounds really traumatic for a childbirth. Like, I don't know if that happens or not. I'm fairly naive in these things, but if I were watching a show like Call the Midwife or something like that, which I don't know if you're familiar with that show, but it's about.
I love that show.
I would think that it would be one of those episodes where they're like, "What do we do? This is like, call in the surgeon," or you would think. And that's neither here nor there. It's just a detail that the point of which is to show you a complicated birth order again. That's why that's there. It's like, the second is usurping the first again, and this is actually what happened historically, and what makes reiterates the point that even the system of preferring the firstborn is not a good system. But if you think about the details of the childbirth itself, it just kind of.
Is this here to provide history and genealogy, or is the story included for telling?
Say that again. You were breaking up a little bit.
I said, so is this story included here to justify the historical genealogy, down through all of these generations to David and Jesus, or is it to really tell us something about the nature of God or the nature of women and relationships? Or
I think a little bit of all of those things. I think. So Tamar will be listed in genealogies going forward, and this story will become one of those, like the point I made towards the end. If her children, she was the however many great grandmother of David and important personages, which says that even if you've been put upon and used and abused in this way, you can have a future. So I started by saying this is an interruption in the Joseph novella, and it actually it is, but its placement here is not happenstance. It doesn't flow with the overarching arc of the story, but placing it here shows why the Judah that we meet later in the story has some. He's actually a positive figure. He speaks wisdom into circumstances and volunteers himself for the hard
Benjamin
of staying back. Yeah, and so it helps to maybe explain Judah's character arc as we experience it in the Joseph novella, even if it wasn't necessarily part of the. I mean, you could have jumped straight from here to the Joseph and Potiphar's house, because I mean, chapter 37 ended with him being sold into Potiphar's house. Chapter 39 picks up with Joseph and Potiphar's house. You could have, and that's, you mentioned Sunday school classes. That's what happens. You just kind of
Go
jump
right
I
over
can
the
read
story.
it.
But
I can read the footnote in my Bible that says why it's here. It says the unsavory events of this chapter illustrates the danger of Israel as God separates his people face if they remain among the Canaanites. And while they were God's people, were able to develop into a nation without losing their identity. Judah's actions contrast with those of Joseph's, demonstrating a moral superiority of Joseph to the leadership in Israel fell on his generation. Comparison Judah, but as you said, Judah got better. So
I gotta go.
It might be a small point, but in verse 6, it said Judah got a wife for Ur. And I thought that was kind of, is this kind of common at this time, kind of like a prearranged marriage, or?
Yeah, the patriarch of the household would make the arrangements for the marriages. The two patriarchs of the house would be the ones who argued, now who brokered the deals, and what the exchange of properties would look like, and all of that. So that's what would have been the case. Yes.
Well, it seemed like back when Jacob was sent off, to get a wife, it wasn't as prearranged, so to speak.
Yeah, he had to deal with first Jacob. So he had to deal with Laban as the head of the household.
Right. His uncle, right?
Yeah. But in those days, typically marriages were arranged by the male head of the household.
Okay.
And who had the biggest?
The biggest
dowry?
what?
Who had the biggest dowry?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And the idea was to find an arrangement that would elevate your family's status, but the other family was also trying to do that. It puts you at an advantage if you had a son, to have a daughter marry into your family with various gifts. If you had a daughter, you could marry her into a house with a neighboring family, and maybe it serve as a peace deal, or help with trade with that family, or set up good relations going down the line. And so there could be advantages that cut both ways. But so throughout the course of this, was I breaking in and out my audio?
No.
Or was it clear?
Comment.
Sure.
And this sort of relates back to a letter I sent to you, Heath, when we had the lesson several lessons ago about Lot and his daughters, is that I often wonder how much, as the authors, quote, storytellers, write this down after it's been passed on by oral tradition, how much editorial license has gone in to the actual telling the story, and they decide to, okay, this is happening in the future, and I need to set up something in this previous story, which I can see how your sources struggled with this as well, and deciding, okay, what's going on here, and is what's we're struggling with it right at this moment.
I don't know. I think we have to believe the scripture where it says all the word is God breathed, and it's from God.
I guess I'll be radical and say I tend to question this a bit. Well, the one brother spilled his seed, so he didn't get a child made, so God killed him. A little hard for me to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, me too.
As the some theologians, old theologians, have said, God is unchanging, as opposed to process theology. And I'm sorry, I'm getting off on another rabbit trail. I'm just saying, I do not assume that the scriptures are God's word. It is the inspiration that comes through the hands of humankind who try to tell the story. Now, how much hot water I just got myself in, I'm not sure, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, it's always was difficult for me when God said, go into the promised land and kill everybody. That sounds so harsh, I guess, but he said that because he wanted his people to stay holy. He knew if they were around those people, they were not going to stay holy, and they didn't, because they didn't kill them, not all of them. And when we
This
go,
is a bigger discussion than we have time for, and I don't want to dodge it either, because while I believe all of the scriptures chronologue our grappling with our understanding with God and what God desires, there are passages that are like the ones we're talking about, where God either kills somebody for reasons that are difficult to understand, or orders genocide, not only of persons that are supposedly, not only of cultures that are supposedly morally depraved, but of their children who could have had nothing to do with it. So, and again, this is the memory of a people written down hundreds of years later to
Absolutely.
help grapple with the current reality. Why did we never enter into the promised land? Well, maybe it was an insufficient slaughter of the people who were here before. That is something that is still talked about today whenever there are genocides committed. And a biblical account of trying to see where God fits with that, whilst also saying, I personally don't believe God ordered the annihilation of children. I don't believe that. I think that there are other parts of the scripture that forbid it, make it morally wrong to kill innocent, or the cows and that was not only just the people, like all of the livestock were supposed to be killed. And what made Saul lose the throne was the fact that he didn't sufficiently commit that slaughter, and then tried to sacrifice a cow. It's like, that sounds like something a pro-Davidic monarchy scribe would say long after the fact, to explain why Saul lost the throne.
we don't understand it, because it's God's ways. It's God's ways and his doing. But if you go to the list of words that describe God, you will find wrath in there. He does have judgment, and we don't know it.
It's a human.
We just know he does that.
Interpretation.
Again, this is probably beyond the scope of today's lesson. And again, I don't want to dodge.
I think so. Heath, I need to ask you before we go off. We have not received an email about tomorrow. Are we picking up food?
Oh, 8:30.
8:30. Thank you.
8:30. Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be John.
Yeah, that did. Sure. Well, we will. These things will come up again and again, because this is not the last difficult Bible story that we will consider. So, I think that we will pick up this discussion as we go forward. And thank you for sharing your insights and opinions. Larry said he tried to be, what'd you say, troublemaker?
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'll take on that mantle.
Well, in the spirit of last week's sermon, when we have diverging opinions about what God looks like on paper, we continue to be in communion with one another and find ways of loving with the love of God. That was the point. So
Absolutely.
this is one place where that conviction lives out. So
Because we are all God's creatures
yes,
and he loves us all.
yes. Well, that's a good note to end on, and I will go ahead and end the meeting, and I'll maybe see you tomorrow, Sue, if you're with John. If not,
No, I'm not coming tomorrow. At least I don't think I am.
Jay is going to help out on Saturday.
Pardon? Jay on Saturday, yes.
Jay is going to help out on Saturday.
Yes, that he emailed me
Well,
that
go with
this
God.
morning.
Take care, everybody.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Here. Goodbye from
Hey.
California.
Bye.